So welcome to this next session at this amazing GovTech conference. My name is John Thornhill. I'm the innovation editor at the Financial Times, and it's a great pleasure to be back in Paris to talk at this session. We have one very big question to address today. Could I ask you to take your seats, please? Thank you. The question for this panel is, can democracy survive technology? This question could mean a lot of things, but the way that we are going to interpret it is to ask in what ways modern technologies are challenging our democracies, and most importantly, what can be done to ensure the survival of democracy. As we know, our democracies are under significant strain at the moment. A Pew opinion poll in 2017 found that more than half of American respondents and a majority in many European countries thought that democracy was not working the way that it should. They did not object to the principle of democracy, but the practice. As the late Polish philosopher Zygmunt Bauman told El País, people no longer believe in the democratic system because it does not keep its promises. Over the past 40 years, democracy has made great strides around the world, but it now appears to be in recession. We're going to ask the questions, what can be done to revive democracy? How can the technological threat be tamed? And can technology indeed be part of the solution? To answer these questions, we have a very distinguished panel of experts of various nationalities, backgrounds, and perspectives. They are, from my immediate right, Fogh Rasmussen, who is the co-chairman of the recently formed Transatlantic Commission on Electoral Integrity, which, as the name suggests, is attempting to ensure the elections are fair and free from outside interference. He is also, of course, a former Secretary General of NATO and a former Prime Minister of Denmark. On his right, Natalie Jaresko, who is a US-Ukrainian banker, who now serves as Executive Director of the Financial Oversight and Management Board at Puerto Rico. She is also the former Finance Minister of Ukraine. To her right, Armin Laschet, who is the Minister-President of North Rhine-Westphalia, a CDU politician who serves on the Bundesrat's Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. And Marietje Schaake, who is a Dutch MEP who has taken a great interest in technology and who has been described as Europe's most wired politician, whatever that means. First, I'd like to understand what our panelists think is the main challenge that technology poses to democracy. So Mr. Rasmussen, can you tell us, what is the threat that technology poses to democracy?
I would point to three things. Firstly, we have the technology itself. Technology is actually a good thing for democracy because we have democratized the public discourse. But autocrats and malign actors can misuse technology to try to undermine the credibility and trust within democracies and weaken democracies. We have seen examples. It started with fake news, distribution of news that were not real news. It developed into a more sophisticated way of interference, namely to raise disturbing, divisive issues. And the next step in all that will be what we call deep fake news. And deep fake news is, for instance, a video showing a president saying the most horrible things. You have a technology to really show his or her face, and you will think they are actually saying this. And if you distribute such deep fake news immediately before an election, then it could have a severe impact. So you have a technological problem. Next, politicians are behind the curve in solving those problems. We need lack of coordination between the US and Europe, for instance, so that's a second problem. And thirdly, I would also point to lack of education, lack of knowledge about all this. So these are three problems I see.
Okay, there's a lot of talk about fake news. Could you just define what you mean by that? Because fake news tends to be news that politicians don't like. What is your understanding of it?
Yeah, and you're right. It may also be a very convenient excuse. If you are accused of something, you just say, that's fake news. But a real fake news, of course, that is false news. I mean, news that doesn't exist. But a fake news could also be that you are building on something true, but you are amplifying negative aspects of that. That's also fake news. So fake news can be many, many things.
Right. Natalie, could I come to you? You were finance minister of Ukraine from 2014 to 2016 at a time of incredible tension with your neighbor Russia and a low-level war in eastern Ukraine. What was it like to live through that and try to be a government minister in a democracy at a time like that?
It was extraordinarily difficult. Ukraine really was, especially in 2014, the front line for foreign interference. And it was a testing ground and remains a testing ground for the use of technology as a new generation weapon. 2 days before Christmas in 2015, we had little to no money in our coffers. We were practically speaking suffering from a major debt crisis, a currency crisis, post-revolutionary, and the electricity was shut off in the western portion of the country by a cyber attack for over 250,000 people. This was the first cyber attack. In 2 months of last year, there were over 6,500 cyber attacks on 36 different entities. It has hit politics, finance, media, business, power, and it's not only cyber attacks. It's the ability to influence through junk news, we'll call it, the ability to influence through media, the ability to influence through targeted interception of the security and power forces over decades. It's a hybrid war. It uses every single tool that technology provides to the maximum to play on weak political institutions and to try and get populations who are already struggling with believing in their political institutions to understand what is real and what is not real and how to move forward in building a democracy. It's an extraordinarily difficult environment.
Okay, thank you. Armin, could I come to you? How do things look from North Rhine-Westphalia? What is the technological challenge to democracy that you're confronting there? And how do you worry about misinformation on social media, data ownership, erosion of privacy, and so on? What are the big technological challenges that you confront?
First of all, for democracy, we have a changed relationship between citizen, media, and press. And at the beginning, everybody said this is a good perspective. You can get information from all over the world, from different political opinions. There is no gatekeepers who organize special processes. This was the good thing. But the bad thing, you both mentioned it, is the question, who is the anchor of shared facts? Who can control what are fake news? And what is the influence of the process of the people? And I see that especially from the right wing of the political spectrum, there is a lot of anonymous, aggressive, social bots organized campaigning in the internet. And we have to stabilize the democracy to explain what big opportunities are in the new technologies, but as well, how can you work with it? And you need a lot of education to work for a real democracy in this time.
We were hearing earlier from Justin Trudeau that although technology has changed the way in which politics is conducted, it hasn't changed the fundamentals that you have to, as a politician, engage with the citizens and persuade them of an argument. Has that become harder, or do you think easier in?
Oh, it's sometimes easier because you can directly discuss with the people. I use very active Twitter, so we have really Twitter discussions, which is a good thing. But the problem is you have always to follow fake news on your account. Sometimes you are obliged by law to delete them if they are racistic, anti-Semitic, or whatever is usual in the internet. This is the bad thing. And my feeling is that society is split, more and more split, in your own position, and you always hear the same political statements from people who think like yourself. And this can divide society, and we have to work on measures to unify a society, and therefore we need as well in the future, this is my opinion, critical judgment, public broadcasting. It's more important than before.
Okay. Marietje, as a European parliamentarian, could I ask you to rank, really, what do you think are the biggest problems that technology poses? We've heard a lot about the kind of cyber threat, outside foreign interference. There's also a big debate in Europe about the loss of digital sovereignty, erosion of privacy, economic concentration of power and threat of joblessness. Where do you stand in all of these debates? What do you think is the main issue that we need to confront?
It's a big question, but I'll start with the notion, I think it's underpinning everything we're talking about, and that is that technology is not neutral. And the way in which algorithms are governed, business models are designed, have an extraordinary impact that is not fostering democracy. And I think for a long time we've been misled or confused or deceived, however you want to call it. Think back to the uprisings of young people in North Africa and the Middle East. And this whole notion that Facebook and Twitter were going to make democracy go viral. That simply by having access to the internet, ideas of liberty, ideas of democracy would spread and would be so contagious that people, despite living under immensely repressive regimes, would simply, break free. And that was a gross oversimplification of what these technologies could bring, also because they were never intended to help spread democracy. And so I think one of the big challenges is that digitization often means privatization, and that we have this huge growing of impact and power by a few major technology companies where there's a lot of lack of oversight, lack of accountability for how algorithms rank information. Are they, putting on the top of the rankings of search engines conspiracy theories, disinformation, allegations that are, blatantly false, etc., etc. We have plenty of examples that this is happening. So the lack of accountability for private companies that are taking on ever more responsibilities, processing ever greater amounts of our data, without having any oversight of where that's going, to see whether competition is fair online, to see whether people are discriminated against, to see whether freedom of expression is upheld, or whether some kind of private norm is being measured to see what content should stay online and what is taken offline. Those impacts of big companies dominating the online sphere are among the biggest concerns that I have, because I think they are often not in line with the rule of law. And I think that liberal democracies, for good reasons, have built a rules-based order since World War II, whether it's about safeguarding universal human rights or a trade system that is fair. And we have neglected in Europe and the US to build a rules-based order for the online world. And right at this moment, we're being confronted with completely opposite models. A Chinese top-down, authoritarian model to govern technology. A complete laissez-faire model that we see in the United States, where the market dominates everything. And I think there should be a European or ideally liberal democratic governance model of technology that puts the rule of law and democratic principles first.
Okay, that's a very powerful argument for kind of taming the big tech companies. I mean, I guess the critique of them is that they own our data, they manipulate our minds, they rig our markets and evade our taxes, would be the kind of short European summary of that. What do we do about all that? What practical steps do you think we can take to reorient these companies in the direction that you have just explained?
So there's a lot we can do, but there's also a lot of challenges, and one of them is speed. The technologies develop so fast, and democratic decision-making, I mean, as a member of European Parliament, I can tell you all about how frustratingly slow some of the decision-making is. It's not keeping up. So I think what we'll have to work towards is more what we can think of as sort of framework regulation. So for example, non-discrimination, fair competition, and then empower regulators to do more to investigate. For example, also to have regulators investigate and assess the workings of algorithms. And it doesn't mean we need new regulators. I think we need to empower, you know, the telecoms regulator or the competition watchdog or the non-discrimination or privacy protector regulators in the different countries, so that the principles are much more clearly articulated, but the space of how to assess whether new technologies, the ones that we don't know today, are complying would then be up to the regulators with new powers and new mandates. And potentially, actually, we will also see algorithms looking at the workings of algorithms, right? We may also have to build technology to assess the workings of technology when people are no longer able to sort of distill from a black box or from, you know, millions of lines of code what the intended and unintended consequences were. So we'll need test labs and new ways of dealing with the new reality, but I think the key is to get started. We are not defenseless, we are not paralyzed, we need to get going and be very clear about the principles of democracy that should not be disrupted by technology.
Okay, thank you. Now I want to focus more on trying to come up with solutions. That's really very much the theme of this GovTech Summit, is what can we do to improve the state of our societies and democracies. So Anders, can you tell us more about this Transatlantic Commission that you have set up and now chair? What are you trying to achieve?
We established the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity because the challenge is not only a US challenge, is not only a European challenge. As in all security questions, we need a transatlantic cooperation. So that's why the Commission counts members from both the United States, Canada, and Europe. So North America, Europe. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the purpose of the Commission is firstly to monitor what is going on. We have monitored elections and referendum campaigns. We have also registered unusual activity, and whenever we see such unusual activity, we will publish the results. Secondly, the Commission aims at developing new technologies, to promote new technologies, to counter such foreign interference. I mentioned already deepfake. Deepfake is, as I mentioned, videos where you pretend to be, you show, for instance, Mr. Trump or another president saying horrible things, and you would believe this is the person saying that, but it isn't. It's a machine, but it pretends to be the president. That's a very dangerous development, and it's just round the corner. Already today, you barely can't distinguish between the true Trump and the fake Trump. At the Peace Paris Forum, we have a stand in which people can test whether they're listening to the true Trump or fake Trump. Most people can't. So what we do is to develop a new technology. We engage with tech companies. We have got the first sponsorship to develop this new technology so that you can detect what is fake, what is not. Secondly, or thirdly, when it comes to technology, it's a question about securing your electoral systems. A new technology called blockchain can be used, potentially can be used to secure your electoral systems. We are also trying to develop new technologies in that respect. And finally, I would mention education. I think education is very, very important in making people aware of what is going on. And that's also a purpose of the Transatlantic Commission, to raise awareness, because I do believe that if people are aware of the risk, they will also become more resilient.
Okay. Natalie, you gave a very powerful statement of what the problems were confronting you in Ukraine. But I also know that you think very strongly that technology can empower citizens. Could you talk more about that? How can technology be part of the solution to this as well?
So I think it's fascinating that in a place like Ukraine, where technology has been used, as I described, so negatively, and as we look at the potential for foreign Kremlin interference in Ukrainian elections in March, as well as in September, there's also an incredibly powerful tool in technology. Ukraine has risen 18 places in the open data barometer because of the use of open data to empower civilians to participate in democracy. We have an online budget that every citizen can mine and determine how monies are being used, how their taxpayer dollars are being used in real time. We have online registers of businesses, including beneficiary ownership of those businesses, online registers of all legislation, online registers of all individuals and land title. This has all happened since the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. And this is as much an empowerment through technology as we talk about risks. And another way to empower, I would argue, the citizens of Ukraine is the task force that the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity is working on in Ukraine, along with the Atlantic Council, to empower citizens by looking at the cyber attacks, to look at the disinformation, as well as the hybrid war attacks in this period in the upcoming to the elections. Looking at the data sources, looking and trying to trace the foreign interference, making that known to citizens, making that known to the politicians, making it known to other countries, again, to other governments, to see how these things are happening in real time on this front line, and educating the people before the elections, educating other governments about what is to come, what the newest innovations in these risky, election interferences. All of this is, in my mind, about empowering people, both on the positive side as well as defensively from the negative side.
Thank you. Armin, could you tell us more about the position in North Rhine-Westphalia? What are you doing to use technology to try to revive democracy? How are you engaging with your citizens in new ways now?
Yes, the first thing is, and I would answer to the remark before, it's a big opportunity. Open data is excellent for more democracy, for the participation of the people. We need a restructuring of the administration, that's all true. But the second question is, how can we set the rules? And you spoke a lot about transatlantic rules, transatlantic common values. We can try it, but I'm not sure whether that will be at the end the answer, because it's like in the economy. We have the social market economy in Europe with a special tradition, which has a combination of the freedom of the people and the rules set by the state for social and ecological and other reasons. And I think this is the same here. In the United States, we have more the tradition, you mentioned it, of laissez-faire. Everybody can use his technologies with less control by rules. And the other example is China. Artificial intelligence used to control the people. You can see what are they doing in the internet, and then you give a place for the child in the school, a possibility to go into a foreign country, controlled by artificial intelligence. And we, the Europeans, are in the middle. We have our ideas of human beings, and we can decide, is it more participation, is it more for the people, or is it more problems and weaken democracy? And this is what it's the old discussion we had in the economy, now we have with the new technologies.
Okay. Marietje, one of the hit books of the summer has been Yuval Noah Harari's book on 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And in that he paints rather a bleak picture about our technological future, in that he claims that there's a danger that our citizens become economically useless and politically powerless. When computers understand us better than ourselves, we are stripped of human agency. And in a way, given the technology that we have available, that our citizens aren't actually very useful for military purposes anymore. There is an argument that democracy was built because the leaders of countries thought that citizens were vital for fighting wars. That might not be true in the future. How do we stop this really very bleak future from happening? How do we make sure that citizens remain economically useful and politically powerful?
Well, indeed, Harari spells out sort of core questions about what it means to be human, and also, what it means to have a free will, or whether such a thing still exists. And that, of course, the whole notion of free choice and a free will is at the heart of liberal democracy. And so I think it is very important that a broad audience now sees, what trends there are in also biotech that he describes, and technology. But I think, again, coming back to what I mentioned earlier, it's not like we are stagnant while the technologies evolve onwards. We need to also evolve and start designing for the outcomes that we want. It is not like we are powerless, but we have to understand what is at stake. And I think in Europe, where I focus most, we haven't really come to grips with, for example, the fundamental challenge that China and its top-down governing of technology, just like it governs its society and it governs its people, is coming our way. It's not only about freedoms, which I think is fundamentally important. It's also about markets. It's also about market access. It's also about military technology and, taking knowledge from Europe into China with a completely different purpose. So, there's so much in this, but I think we need to start connecting the dots and start designing governance and policies for outcomes that we believe maintain these fundamental pillars of liberal democracy, of being humans, of the value of humans in work, of education for the future, of not only ethics, which is an often referenced frame to think in terms of preserving values that matter, but also the rule of law. I really want to stress that, because what's ethical in Russia is not the same as what is ethical in the Netherlands. And so if we have global companies that can vaguely talk about ethics as a counterweight to artificial intelligence, and we're not very, very articulate and clear about what those ethics mean, we are blurring our vision. And I think we in Europe should shamelessly and very ambitiously stand for a rule of law and democratic order for the online and technological world. And that is not to regulate everything in a stifling manner, but really to be extremely clear about what should not be disrupted, no matter what technological wave blows over us.
Okay. Natalie, did you want to come in?
I just wanted to comment. I think we talked a lot about the differences in our communities from North America to Europe to China, but there is one common element that the Transatlantic Commission really focuses on, and that is the value of the vote. The value of everyone in our democracies to make their decisions on the best possible information without foreign interference. And so I agree with you, we shouldn't try to come up with one single, probably impossible, to come up with one single set of transatlantic rules or regulations. But there is one thing that we all commonly believe in, and that is the value of our vote and the value of that vote to having a true democracy. And that's why I think the Commission's focus, not so much on regulation, but on identifying, monitoring in real time the changes, the approaches, the challenges of foreign interference in our elections in our referendums, in our democracy, is something that unites all of us across all of the countries, despite our differences in how we might approach regulation, how we might approach markets and competition policy.
I think that's absolutely true, and the right of an individual to elect his or her government without interference is also enshrined in the Universal Declaration. The challenge is, of course, then, how far do you want to go, and who should guarantee that this freedom and this right is upheld? And with, global supply chains, increased use of technology, looking in, the inner workings of the systems that are used, making sure that they are resilient and secure. I think we saw so many reminders just looking at the midterms in America, not necessarily, a third world country when it comes to technology. And we saw some actually, staggering weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the technologies used for voting. So I believe that we have to be serious about this right. I can't agree with Natalie more, but I think we also have to then act accordingly and spend money on it where it's necessary. This is another thing. Democracy costs money, and not many people are willing to ask for what is necessary to have resilient and robust democracy these days.
All right. Now, I'm keen to squeeze in a couple of questions. We're quite tight for time, but I'd like 2 questions. Could we get the microphones to them, please? There's a lady in the front here, and then a gentleman a few rows behind.
Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful discussion. Elizabeth Linder with Beautiful Destinations, and previously at Google, YouTube, and Facebook, where I spent 8 years building the Politics and Government division. Something that I really noticed during my years at Facebook is that not only were we a bit behind perhaps as leaders on the technology, but also on the mindset. And so there was a scenario where all of the interns and the junior members of staff were running all of the Facebook pages and the Twitter accounts. And I think many of them were spotting the very issues that we're discussing today, but because they were in the lower ranks of leadership, not even in leadership ranks at all, we had massive blind spots that potentially we could have learned from. So how, as leaders, current leaders as yourselves, and also emerging leaders in the room, how can we think differently about the ways in which we work better across different generations to take seriously perspectives that are not traditionally perhaps part of the circles where we make key decisions in our societies?
Okay, that's a great question. Can we just have the second question from the gentleman behind you, just over there?
Hi there. My name is Sushant. I'm a Canadian entrepreneur. I run a startup that does participatory decision-making using AI and collective intelligence. Now, the thing that I'm most struck by in these GovTech conferences is that the emphasis is on the delivery of services, not in how those services are created. It seems like our democracies right now suffer from a crisis of legitimacy, where people do not participate because the intermediaries don't rank their preferences, or the choices for participation are very binary.
We're very tight for time. Can you ask a question?
So the question is, how do you imagine democracies adapting to this communication era and tomorrow's communication era that may not require intermediaries?
Okay, both good questions. Anders, do you want to start?
Yeah. The first question is a very important question. How could we, so to speak, cover the generational gap? I fully agree, and I think education is really an important issue. But it's similarly an important issue to realize that the younger generation do not consider, for instance, Facebook as their main social media. They have turned to other media like WhatsApp, Snapchat, I don't know what. So I think we should also shift or change our focus from Facebook. We are used to discuss Facebook, but there may be other media as well that are very important here. Secondly,
Could I stop you there and actually ask Marietje to answer the second question, if that's right?
Oh, the second one. I was also very tempted to answer the first one, but I don't want to address you as representing Facebook or Google, but I do think that from the very example that you gave, it shows that leadership has been lacking. that there has not been an appreciation for the enormous responsibility that comes with the big power that these big technology companies have, not only in engaging generations, which I think makes sense, or different communities, if you want to call it that, in the United States, for example, but also abroad. I mean, to decide on what speech stays up or is taken down in a country where ethnic violence is happening, as we saw in Myanmar, without having people on the ground, without spending money, even though you have billions of profits, to just sit and understand what goes on the other side of the world, I think is the real problem here.
And
so it's an
second
accountability issue. Sorry, the second
Very
question.
briefly, could you address the second question?
Yes, I mean, the whole question about how services are being created and the disappearance of intermediaries, I think, offers both new challenges and opportunities, right? So I think governments need to gain speed when it comes to service delivery in order to not only have more trust, which I think is the key word here, but also better, let's say, customer or citizen satisfaction with how they use technologies to make dealing with government simple, and thereby hopefully rebuild some of that trust in the relationship.
All right, I'm afraid that we have run out of time, but I think that was a fantastic session for giving us a sense of the scale of the challenges that we confront, but also for coming up with some really practical solutions and suggestions for how we can counter those challenges. So thank you very much to the members of the panel.